We're going to take this last opportunity in this week 12 PowerPoint video to take it through some of the discussion around what is called cardiometabolic disease or the metabolic syndrome. This has received a great deal of attention over the past several years. We've referred to this in a number of our assignments through our time together, and also we'll take the opportunity from this point forward to talk more about what is this correlation between type 2 diabetes, its growing epidemic expression, and cardiovascular disease, and the many classic and emerging risk factors that appear to be related to this. There's a lot of literature out there today and a lot of discussions around what we need to know about the cardiometabolic disease and how often it's being presented in the physician's office, and relatable to our subject, what that means from a nutritional standpoint, what we can do to offset it, and what we can do to correct those problematic manners in which people find themselves growing into an overweight condition, followed and correlated very closely with, again, risk of cardiovascular disease. So again, let's get started. I chose this slide, the second slide, looking at the prevalence of obesity and diabetes and its increase. And look at these years of 1994 as a sort of a beginning point. We know that the problem began before then, but let's use that snapshot of 10 years to see in the coloration of the maps, again, the parallel experience between seeing obesity increase as well as the increase in diabetes. So from 1994, we see coloration on the map telling us that there was far little, well, relative to 2004, much less incidence of diabetes and obesity, but that by 2004 we can see, again by coloration of the map, that everything is really changing very, very dramatically. And again, we'll follow this period in our minds as we move forward to think about what are those factors related to why obesity is on such a rise, and yet we know that there are long-standing parameters and long-standing factors behind why diabetes follows so closely, and we see that correlation play out day in and day out. So again, just simply taking 94 to 2004 just as an early time snapshot, and to know that from 2004 to 2013, what does the coloration of that map look like, but other than it's continuing to enhance in coloration every year to be certain. We're all quite aware that the direct cost of these diseases in the U.S. and really around the world continue to grow exponentially. And here's just a small chart to tell us that if we're looking at some of the most commonly seen maladies out there today in the medical field and in general health, that of course coronary heart disease and hypertension and stroke are very prevalent, but that what's sort of leading the cost charge, so to speak, is type 2 diabetes and obesity. And again, as we've seen in a couple of the prior slides, there's a parallel track that these are taking together. But we also know that with respect to type 2 diabetes and obesity, that the following coronary heart disease, stroke, and hypertension follow very closely. So those direct costs to the medical care system, to the consumer, to the government, all again tell a story that is all too compelling when we're thinking about where will that cost ultimately take us, when some suggestion is that by the year 2050, will we see upwards of somewhere over 50 million people with type 2 diabetes as a firm diagnosis. How many of us are familiar with the NCEP clinical identification of the metabolic syndrome? And know that within the endocrinology community and the cardiology community over these past several years, there's been quite a bit of debate around this and what risk factors really do qualify one for the metabolic syndrome and what even those numbers should reflect. But here at least is some glimpse at what has traditionally been held to be 5 of the most important risk factors for the metabolic syndrome or the cardiometabolic disease, and that being abdominal obesity, triglycerides, HDL, subfractionation, blood pressure, as well as fasting glucose. And the numbers on the right indicate to us what those landmarks and what those threshold numbers are, above which or below which one would put one at risk and qualify one as that person with the metabolic syndrome. And according to this chart, it tells us that anyone with 3 or more of these risk factors is clearly that person who carries that significant and ultimate risk. visualization of the kind of risk that takes place in a intra-arterial fashion here tells us that uh, the development of plaque and the stages of plaque development generally occur over a long period of time, but do so insidiously such that it may occur that when we finally get to a blockage or a fibrous cap or this clot formation, that we're at the final throes of what could be ultimately an event. So again, while we want to be certain we understand the risk factors of the metabolic syndrome and what those 5 are and whether people qualify and cluster as 3 or more of those risk factors, what is the real story being told here? It's the real storytelling is being told that within the arteries, within the vasculature of the body, that this kind of plaque development may likely take place at an enhanced rate, placing one again at risk for stroke or a cardiovascular event. So this is a story again that has to be shared with the patient such that they don't get so enamored with the numbers or so confused by what they think they need to believe about them other than what the risk is and what the result of those numbers may actually be. This graphic description just basically tells us what the role of blood pressure is. That can continue to cause the damage when the laying down or the accumulation of cholesterol in the arterial walls will begin that plaque process. So when we're thinking about controlling blood pressure, and even while we're talking so often as we do about the lipids, the LDL and the HDL and those ratios and their importance, what do we know then about the contributing factor of blood pressure? And even as it remains its silent killer, that's something again that the patient and the person and the general public needs to be aware of, and why it's important, particularly in the presence of those other risk factors, why controlling blood pressure is such an important thing. It's probably also a good idea at times to just continue to familiarize ourselves with the general and with the customary language that describes what that heart disease is or that heart attack, and how we can take those kinds of terminologies and those descriptions and those stories we can tell clinically to the patient, again, to bring that to a meaningful conclusion as to what they can expect their cardiometabolic disease or the metabolic syndrome to bring to them. So that as we talk about modifiable risk factors and modifying those risk factors, we know that we can begin to decrease the likelihood that any of this might continue to take place. So just by virtue of being able to have that discussion with these individuals, that's something that they oftentimes encounter just in their general reading. And let's all always be mindful that that discussion when we're talking about cardiovascular disease also needs to have discussion around what that role is for the patient who is at risk for stroke. And that when we're even looking at cardiovascular risk, the cerebrovascular risk is also important. We also know that today a growing interest in understanding and diagnosing peripheral vascular disease also shares this same platform. So we can describe to the patient that overall the body is this pool, is this recipient of these disease risks that can not only affect those arteries that affect directly the heart, but also those that can be found again in the periphery of the body, as well as importantly in the brain. Many of us have encountered the discussion with people that when speaking about diabetes, they may be in some fashion familiar with the two types, but in general will often confuse those. And it wouldn't be unusual to find people not know that type 2 diabetes is as prevalent, or at least 90% of the diabetes that we see out there. Although when people think of diabetes, they think often in terms of the traditional form and don't really know the difference. So maybe with respect to finding those kinds of simple descriptions and designations and differences, we can articulate for them just how important and how prevalent type 2 diabetes is. And that even though later onset, or what was earlier or later or earlier called adult onset, and now type 2 diabetes is creeping into the teen years. So we begin to see those type 2 kids that we didn't see just 30 years ago or so, or at least certainly not at the rate that we do today. Here's some speculation from the World Health Organization back in 2004, that important end period we looked at earlier when we were looking at that increase or that coloration of those maps and the parallel track that diabetes and obesity was taking, and where we might see from an estimate around the world in developed countries or developing countries, the numbers and the growth by, let's say, the year 2030. And we can see that that rate will double from 2000 to 2030 just across the world. So again, this is an experience that many of the medical communities are seeing, and really not very clearly just in underdeveloped countries, but also those countries that are fully developed. And it really does tell us that the risk we take for inaction will not cost money, which we certainly need to be mindful of, but certainly as more and more importantly, the cost that will have in lives and effect on families and communities and cultures around the world. So the role of body mass index and as it increases is here by this description and by this slide tells us that that increase can be dramatic. So here let's look at a BMI of 18.5 to 24.9, which we normally consider to be quite healthy and normal. And that once we begin to reach 25, we start seeing not only what we would classify as someone being overweight, but also we now begin to climb the ladder towards cardiovascular risk. Many more of these studies and indications not only tell us that cardiovascular risk is something to be concerned about, but also the risk or the relative risk of cancer mortality based on that increase in the BMI. So that clearly by a BMI of 35 and 40, we can see where among men and women that can grow really, really problematically. And again, is another reason to have that discussion with individuals and not only place the importance on overall what a BMI or healthy BMI should look like, or its relate to cardiovascular disease, but now, as we've known for quite a while, what that risk may be towards increasing cancer mortality risk. Another look at what abdominal adiposity, or this waist circumference measured as inches, what can that tell us about the risk of diabetes? So here we can see that, again, when we're looking at a waist circumference and those numbers that we customarily think of with respect to the metabolic syndrome, which would be a goal of less than 35 inches for women and less than 40 for men, again, we can see where the relative risk begins to really ramp up once we begin to approach 34 or 35 inches and above. Now, this doesn't take into account gender stipulations or articulations or differences, but overall, yes, the risk does increase. And some of the well-formed studies now tell us that if we look at BMI versus waist circumference, can we even see waist circumference as even being more of a reliable indicator of this risk as opposed to BMI? And that's being sort of sorted out even today, but that we can't altogether forget things like waist to hip ratios, or again waist circumference or BMI, as ways in which it can tell us what that risk would look like given a person may reach that at some point. So in like fashion, like we've just looked at, and waist circumference related to the risk of type 2 diabetes, what have we said all along in this treatment of the metabolic syndrome or cardiometabolic disease, but that type 2 diabetes and cardiovascular disease or coronary heart disease follow a similar path, that parallel path. So here, again, we can see that as the waist circumference begins to grow, look for example, once we get to 32 to 35 inches and then up above 35 to 56, that we're well above what we would see as a normal risk for somebody developing that. And again, this kind of information gleaned from the many studies out there today tell us that is a discussion that we can have with people when talking to them about their weight may be something they try to avoid, but that more simply, if they're looking for more of an anthropometric look at where they can decrease risk, maybe they can look at something like waist circumference to find some solace, so to speak, as they go about their business of trying to shed some of those pounds and shed some of that risk. We're certainly not going to have to have this discussion with certainly the general public when we sit down in front of them and have a discussion around why, if we begin with some endothelial injury and the laying down of LDL and what can happen downstream, or not only with respect to physiology but also in time, but that ultimately what we may end up with is some kind of a platelet aggregation and later risk for some kind of a cardiovascular event or a heart attack. So sometimes when we're offering these kinds of graphic descriptions and representations of that whole process, that can appear to be overwhelming, but many of us certainly have had that experience in our learnings to know that as that process begins to take form, that it isn't always the same for all in terms of when that risk would ultimately meet with some event, and whether that may be something that can happen over a very short period of time for someone, or may be something that someone may linger in someone for years before actually presenting itself. So again, as this may be hopeful kind of information, sometimes again the graphic description is something that hits home with a lot of people. Sometimes if you'd like to have some impact with people when you're having that discussion around what type 2 diabetes is natural history, this is a nice representation looking at what we know about, let's say as an example, say around insulin secretion and the relative normalcy of fasting blood glucose in the impaired glucose tolerance state, that for in some cases up to 5 to 10 years before there's some kind of a actual diagnosis and a confrontation with it, that when it goes from undiagnosed to a known diabetes status, oftentimes we see people report that they have normal fasting blood glucose levels, but if we were to check their insulin levels, we might see a hyperinsulinemic state, which might be a strong indicator that something unfortunate is about to occur in terms of their ultimate diagnosis and transformation towards it. So look, as we know around known diabetes, what might happen once insulin secretion tends to dip precipitously is that we then see a parallel increase in the fasting blood glucose, which would be a hallmark of that diagnosis. As we conclude then our discussion and our time here together with the cardiometabolic syndrome, it's not without some interest, I would think, that I hope you would find looking at what is called the endocannabinoid system and its history here in graphic form. While this is extremely difficult and busy to appreciate in its format this way, rest assured that there have been, within the last 10 to 15 years, a good body of drug development and research around what this endocannabinoid system is, how it's related to weight gain and weight loss, and the decrease in the risk of cardiovascular events because of perhaps even blocking it back in '64, with THC being isolated as a psychoactive ingredient in marijuana. It was later discovered over the years that the CB1 blockers within the body, or CB1 receptors in the body, that were agonized by it, causing weight gain in part, could also be found, if blocked, to decrease weight gain, and with it the lowering of HDL, the lowering of LDL, the raising of the HDL, the decrease in cardiovascular events, and the reversal of diabetes, among other kinds of complementary effects. But was found in some of this drug research, and there was at least one company that had released a CB1 blocker, as it was called, back in the mid-2000s, only to remove it from the market just a year or two after, but not without a great deal of fanfare and interest to find that if a drug were available to have somebody lose anywhere between 20 and 30 pounds, and to have those complementary cardiovascular effects that would decrease their risk in a significant way, why not research it? So today, they're back at the drawing board in many cases, just at least, if not a few of these companies. But there's some believe that this area of blocking CB1 receptors in the body holds some hope for, again, decreasing the risk for metabolic syndrome, cardiometabolic disease, and those people who have been diagnosed with it. I hope this discussion's been helpful. Thanks.